data, global fertilizer prices were already quite high for at least a year now due to shortages of natural gas and limited fertilizer stockpiles, which are just getting worse with the invasion. Now, right before the invasion, actually Russia and China had imposed export quotas on fertilizer exports through at least June of 2022. And because of sanctions now, it's of course very difficult to source fertilizer from Russia as well as Belarus, which also exports fertilizer. And just recently, the Ministry of Trade and Industry for Russia has actually threatened to put a total export ban on fertilizer exports. Of course, also the rise of oil prices fueled by the invasion is making the transport of fertilizer and shipping costs more expensive, which have knock-on effects for both fertilizer importers and distributors. And I think problematically, given the current circumstances, Russia is not only among the world's biggest producers and exporters of fertilizer, but it's one of the few that actually produces all three nutrients needed for fertilizer, including nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate.
Oh, that's certainly a pretty grim situation that you're painting there. But with all these export bans that are coming into place and the input shortfalls you've pointed to in the gas side of things, is there perhaps alternative suppliers that can essentially step up their production to help fill the gap that may be left in the market by the export bans we're seeing from Russia, from China?
Yes, well, I mean, unfortunately, China and Russia are some of the biggest exporters of fertilizer. There's, of course, other sources. Canada and the United States as well are big producers. The U.S., though, only exports certain amounts in sizable quantities, so it still relies quite a bit on importing nitrogen from places like Russia to make fertilizer. And this can have knock-on effects for Africa, which is particularly reliant on nitrogen-based fertilizer. There are some other places that particularly sub-Saharan Africa does source from usually, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, as well as Chile, Germany, and Jordan. And there has been growing efforts since the last food price crisis to increase production within the continent, with growing efforts in places particularly like Nigeria and South Africa. But even a month ago, before the invasion, there were some reports that at least 100 fertilizer blending plants on the continent had to curb their output simply because they couldn't get the right amount of nutrients from places like China and Russia. So there are certainly other places to source from, but there will certainly be a supply crunch, which is going to increase prices given the huge demand.
Indeed. Let's talk about the food side of things as well, because now we're also seeing that countries like Egypt, for example, are imposing bans on the export of wheat. Theirs, in fact, actually coming into effect today. A ban on export of wheat, various grain flours and food items for the next 3 months. Should we expect more of this to become essentially become the norm, perhaps, in 2022?
I think it certainly is possible. Export bans are a common reaction when there's a food price crisis. We did see this within Africa and Asia in particular during the last food price crisis. Egypt is, of course, probably one of the most vulnerable countries, particularly on the African continent, to the sanctions on Russia and the blockage of trade with Ukraine, because it's highly dependent on imports of wheat from that region. But of course, for decades, it's heavily subsidized bread to maintain social stability. Sudan has similar dynamics, so it would also be vulnerable to potentially the regime putting an export ban there. Further afield, we are seeing places like Serbia, Hungary, Romania have also noted that they're going to restrict grain exports. And then even Indonesia has now put an export ban on exports of palm oil, because that edible oil is also seeing an increase in prices, and that's a key input for cooking. Just recently, we saw the Nigerian agribusiness billionaire Aliko Dangote advocating for Nigeria to put a ban on maize exports, and that was given some support by the milling industry as well in Nigeria. This, of course, has a negative impact on foreign exchange if you put an export ban in place, but producers, consumers, and millers can advocate for this as a way of maintaining food security.
Indeed, but the flip side of it is this, because you've got a lot of sub-Saharan African economies which have agriculture either as the biggest component of GDP or as the biggest employer, as it were. And here we are signing up to this big free trade agreement and saying we need to trade more with each other. I mean, can the CFTA perhaps be in pole position now to try at least make the argument that we can solve our food supply issues by trading more with each other?
Yes, I mean, I think we can all agree that the concept of the African Continental Free Trade Area is very admirable, and that this right now is actually a defining moment for the concept of this free trade area. You know, how much this concept of free trade across the continent is actually valued will be tested by whether African policymakers do resort to nationalist claims and close their borders for certain commodities. I think, you know, in the short term, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not going to have much impact here because it's not really fully operational yet. In the medium term, though, I mean, you could see really big advantages in circumstances like this. You know, one, for example, if we do see a shortage in global supply of palm oil, a place like Tanzania, which has, you know, huge capacity to produce palm oil, could be a supplier to other countries on the continent. Similarly, for fertilizer, if we are able to increase the production side on the continent, particularly in places like Nigeria and South Africa, we could see, you know, a benefit for other countries in the region to make them a little bit less dependent on overseas imports for that critical input. So certainly advantages if we do subscribe to the idea, the concept that free trade is good across the region and are able to resist the kind of nationalist tendencies to put up export bans and other trade barriers.
Indeed. One last question for you, Danielle. Across this continent, especially in the last 24 months, incomes, jobs have been completely eroded by the COVID-19 pandemic. Debt levels have gone up. Now we're seeing inflation being stoked by a whole host of factors. Given the sort of crisis we're confronting here, what can countries do to cope?
So I think that's a great question. It's obviously a critical time for the region. I think there's at least 4 channels that we could consider. One is on the consumer side and governments providing greater consumer support, particularly providing subsidies for commodities where the prices have increased, but not to the same extent that we're seeing for things such as wheat, for example. So places like Senegal, for instance, I know the government actually just prior to the invasion was already doing this with some increased subsidies on rice, sugar, and edible oils. This creates a little bit of a cushion for households to, you know, reallocate money towards things that are really increasing in cost, particularly transport costs. Other opportunities are increasing consumer subsidies for more domestically produced cereals like sorghum and millet and away from wheat in particular. The second channel on donor support is really key. Even prior to the invasion, the IMF was talking about setting up a resilience and sustainability trust fund of about $50 billion to help low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries adapt to shocks like this. It was set up intended to respond to COVID, but the IMF director has now been saying that this Ukraine crisis is another opportunity for helping countries get through food crises. I think also donors, particularly the IMF, will be a bit more relaxed about certain conditions they've asked African countries to make in recent months. You know, putting up, asking countries like Kenya to put up higher levies on gas and cooking oil. There may be some sense of relaxing those types of restrictions. Thirdly, on tariffs and taxes, there could be opportunities for governments to temporarily reduce or remove the tariffs on wheat flour imports. Certain milling organizations have been advocating for this, particularly in Francophone countries. And then also considering reducing VAT taxes on particular goods that are facing the highest inflation. Finally, on the production side, you know, for many years, a number of African countries have put in place fertilizer input subsidies. I don't think that will be affordable in this case, given how much fertilizer is shooting up and the constrained supply. But I think this is really an opportunity for there to be greater investment in domestically produced or continentally produced fertilizer production. Also greater investment in more innovative ways to engage in organic and conservation farming. So in some ways, you know, there's certainly always disadvantages to a crisis like this, but often opportunities as well to find more sustainable and productive ways to produce food in the region.